tools and accessibility in games. So I should start with who I am. I was one of Ryan's former co-workers. I was, until recently, I was a tools engineer at Oxide Games, working on Art History Untold, a 4X historical grand strategy game that released just last year in September. And so obviously I have experience in tools if I'm a tools engineer, but as well, in the lead up right before launch, everyone does a little bit of everything. A lot of the accessibility work ended up in my work, so that's why I decided to talk about tools and accessibility today. So, tools and accessibility, what are we even talking about here? So tools, I can kind of think of generally two kinds of tools. Things that make it easier or possible to do some sort of task in the game design process, or the game design could be art, could be a little bit of everything. You use all sorts of tools to make something easier possible. Kind of lesser thought of tool might be something that will tell you something that you didn't know about or didn't notice. Things like reports or like error messages, things like that. I'll get into more specific examples in a moment. But if we want to think about accessibility, it's kind of the same thing actually, right? You want to make it easier possible for someone to perform a task. The task itself is a little bit different because it's someone actually playing a game as opposed to someone making a game. But it's still the same idea. You want to make it easier possible to perform a task, or show something that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see or notice or know about. Yeah, so if you wanted to depict it a little bit schematically like this, you could say that like you as the tools programmer on this side or the game dev on this side create something in order for this process at the bottom to go through. Just like the game dev will create the game or the player will start playing the game. Ideally have fun. So just some examples of tools. These are things we all kind of know about. Like I said, they're part of like every discipline. If you do music, notation software. If you do art software. I'm not an artist. I don't know what you do over there. Like Unity editors or any kind of editor in for any game engine. Maybe it's one tool. You could probably consider it like a whole like collection of tools. And what I work in most of the time is like some sort of like software or text editor just to work on code directly. So these are examples of things that make it easier possible to perform a task. You can't really go into the hard drive and manually edit every bit to make a picture. That would be a bad idea. And for the other things that, example of things that would show you what you wouldn't know or notice. Like I said, it's a lot of reporting stuff. This is just, task manager. You don't know what's going on in your CPU, but it's a good idea if you want to know about it. Something like that would be fun to include, or fun to use to know about what's going on there. And on the left, it's very blurry. Okay, it is I have a compiler error message, and I feel like could be considered something that you wouldn't know about. Like, it would point you directly to the part of the code that is having a problem. Whereas if you work in like plain C or C++ and you just get like a runtime error, it will just say segfault or something. And if you've experienced it, you just know, it's something that's just really annoying. You have no idea where it is. Whereas actual errors and warnings will point you directly to the problem. And over here, I just have a graph. This is just Google Trends. It can be graphs about anything, just any sort of data. It will be hard to visualize unless you put it in a graph form. This is just like Christmas, Halloween, and Easter. You probably can't see it from back there. And visually, you can see that it comes up in spikes. Like, if you didn't know that this was something that happened once a year, you would now very clearly see that. So obviously, those are all tools that exist out in the world. My job is not to just find these things and be like, look, I'm done. My job was to make things that people wanted that did not already exist. And in that, the best thing to think about is what am I or the person working on the game, what am I having trouble with, or what is a problem that is very easy to miss? I think these are probably the two key questions to think about for you and for the person using it. So in the cases where you are not both the person creating the tool and using the tool, talk with each other. It's very important to have clear expectations on what you want, what you don't need as well, and just generally not to waste time on anything that's not necessary. Here's an XKCD comic. I can't tell if you can see it from back there, but this is the idea of if you wanted to make it.
Oh, sorry.
Left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like it's auto. There we go.
So ideally, you wanted to do some work. You write a little bit more. You do a little bit more work writing code, and then your workload is lower. In practice, your workload's here. You do some code. There's a lot of rough patches. You rethink some things, and then the workload goes up as you keep developing stuff. All the while, the original work is still there. This is why we need people developing tools separately if you have the capabilities from the people using the tools, because there can be a lot of back-end work here. So another thing to keep in mind is just like how much time is the tool going to take, or how much resource do we have to spend on this sort of thing. So as a specific example of the tool, so at Rockstar we have a particular data format, which we call ZData, which we use to, from one perspective, separate out some game logic from like the code itself, and from another one perspective, have something that we can deeply integrate into the engine as opposed to just a generic XML or JSON. So you could consider that as a tool itself, but let's take that as a given that this data format exists. It looks like this. That's not very friendly for artists or audio people or whoever to just type in and use. So one thing we created was an Excel-like GUI where you could put it, just type it to some sort of like graphical editor. But even more specifically, for Aura in particular, we have, for example, farms that can take in different types of crops. Again, this is quite blurry. There's cotton on the right and some sort of spice on the left. And the general asset is the same, but the particular crop is different. And the way we specify the different crops is with the ZData files. And again, we have something that particularly specialized for this to edit all that directly. So it's easier to, it's harder to mess up. Because if you mess it up, it'll be hard to notice in some cases. And this editor is also integrated directly into the game, so you can open up and see the changes live rather than having to go to a text editor, change something, restart the game, and then open up the save file or something like that. And it makes the iteration time a lot faster. Before we go on to accessibility, I wanted to touch on AI tools because we live in the year that we do. Really though, I don't think they're that different from non-AI tools. Because in principle, everything that is different is back-end. Once you're using the tool, this bottom layer, everything's the same, non-AI or AI. If you are, however, like the one implementing something, there are certain questions. Is the training data correct? Is the training process correct? Things like that. Also, just in general, ethics are a huge can of worms. I'm not going to get into it right now because I'm not qualified probably as much as other people are, but also just it's a huge question and it could be a talk on its own. But the thing is just mainly to make sure that the tool really is the thing that you want it to do. Especially with AI, that you can also often get into like caught up in the marketing speak of like it will. I am bad at marketing speak. Imagine some vague claims that they might make. Just be aware of what the like inputs and outputs of the tool are, why you need it, the questions that I listed out earlier. Yeah, so moving on to the second half of this, I wanted to talk about accessibility. So some examples on the first kind of accessibility I was talking about, making it easier to perform some sort of task. You think of like inputs and outputs, things like adaptive controllers. Xbox has a really unique adaptive controller where you can plug in any kinds of buttons into it to suit your particular needs. Something we did in Aura, for example, is a little bit more limited in scope to the keyboard, but you can remap keys to any key on the keyboard. But also things like motion sickness. Maybe you don't think of that as an accessibility feature, but like, you know, you don't want to be in pain while you're playing a game, so things that alleviate pain for some people might make it, you know, easier to play the game, to enjoy the game. What you probably think of more often with accessibility is the second category, making things more accessible. I shouldn't use that word, but making it easier for you to see something or hear something, or understand what's going on. So these are all examples from Aura. So we can have like high contrast text. It is especially clear here because it's super blurry, but on the top one, it's a little bit hard to read in some cases with we have black text on purple background. We have a toggle that we can switch on high contrast text on size adjustment. I don't have a picture here, we have a zoom in on the whole game screen as well. And the thing that took up a lot of my time last year was screen reader compatibility, because we don't think about how blind people or like low vision people might use the computers often, but they often rely on screen readers to read out text. So here, if you hover over a text, and so this one is, in order to depict it visually, I had the window from NVIDIA that will tell you what is being read out by the screen reader. So if your mouse hovers over the in-game text, it will read it out as depicted in the speech viewer. So I did want to touch on the term disability and accessibility in addition to accessibility. So here's some stats from the CDC. 1 in 4 adults in the US have some sort of disability, which is perhaps a lot higher than you might imagine. For one, there are a lot of different kinds of disability. So here are 6 different categories that they list out, and their relative, the rates at which they occur in the US population. So cognition, mobility, independent living, hearing, vision, self-care. 2 of them aren't really relevant to games, but usually you hear about 4 categories of accessibility: vision, hearing, mobility, and cognition. So yeah, there are a wide range of disabilities. And the other thing to keep in mind is that not all disabilities are visible. The term invisible disability means that you can't really tell that a person is disabled just by talking to them, just by like seeing them. Like you wouldn't know someone has chronic pain, for example, unless they told you. So yeah, next. But another reason why I presented some accessibility features before bringing up the term disabled is that non-disabled players can benefit from accessibility as well. Motion sickness is one example. We usually don't think of motion sickness as a disability, or just in general, maybe you just prefer something in larger font. But the other thing is that depending on how we define accessibility, disability, we can define it as needing accessibility, which can be temporary or it can be even situational. So the examples here are like, on the left there are some visual disabilities. If you have a permanent disability, like maybe you were born blind, for example, that is certainly a disability, and maybe even you just had like an eye surgery and you can't use your eyes for a couple weeks. That would be a temporary disability. But additionally, if you are in the sun and there's a glare on your phone, that can be considered a kind of disability, a situational disability in this case. And from that view, we're all disabled at some points in our lives. We all have players on our phone. We all, on the right, for example, is if you're holding something in one hand, maybe you have a child and you are like nursing the child, but you are waiting for something to do and you want to play a game. You have one hand free. That is a situational disability. You aren't permanently or even temporarily really without use of your other arm, but there are times in which all kinds of accessibility features would be useful. So, on implementing accessibility, some things to keep in mind are what are some kinds of common disabilities and accessibility needs, and how can you address them? This is similar to with tools. You should really ask, what do I need? But here it can be more difficult because you are not necessarily, well, you are not every disabled player, for sure. So there are some guidelines. Use the Xbox accessibility guidelines. Here's a screenshot of just like some example things that they have: text and study contrast, subtitles. So there are guidelines you can go through to follow to get some idea of some kinds of accessibility features that might be good. It can be easy to get into the trap of just trying to put a check mark in every box on there, as opposed to actually addressing the accessibility needs. So it is good to remember, the point isn't just to check off boxes on that checklist. It's to actually get people to be able to play your game who might not otherwise be able to do it. Another tip tends to be think about it early in the process. I mentioned earlier that the screen reader I spent a lot of time on. That was something that we decided to do pretty late in the process, and it is quite difficult to retrofit a lot of the UI that was already built to then allow for screen reader accessibility. And again, talk with a lot of the people with who you want to use the features for. Like that is, if there's anything I want to get across, I feel like that's the main point, is that you should talk with the people that you want to use the things that you're using. So I'm not really an expert on all of this. I have some experience on it, but I would encourage you to reach out, if this is something that interests you, to reach out and look into some other resources that are available online. There are a lot of community resources. I'm on Reddit a lot, so there are some subreddits: accessibility, disability, disabled gamers. There's some YouTube channels for disabled gamers and people talking about disability and accessibility in games. Two examples are Ross Miner, who's a blind YouTuber who plays games, and Laura K. Buzz, who has a series on accessibility and different kinds of ways that games haven't been accessible to people. And in addition to just general community resources, there are formal organizations and guidelines. I mentioned the Xbox accessibility guidelines earlier. Able Gamers is another organization that promotes accessibility in games, and they have guidelines at accessible.games. And if you're doing something specialized in your game, you could look at, for example, the general web and mobile app guidelines, the WCAG, or certain data visualization guidelines if you have a lot of graphs in your game, or things like that if you have particular kinds of things in your game. So in summary, both tooling and accessibility are these kinds of invisible things in the background of the game, so we don't often think about it. But they are important parts of the game. Again, talk with the intended user of the tools or accessibility features and know what they need. And finally, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. It's really easy to be overwhelmed by, especially on accessibility. There are a lot of different kinds of accessibility that, as I said, if you can get some of it implemented, that is still a lot better than not having any of it. But also on the tool side, if you can get something stable, as long as it is not easy to mess up, as I mentioned, that is probably a very good thing to keep in mind. But as long as it's not easy to mess up, having a half-working tool will still be more useful for the person than having no tool at all. And I believe I am done. So thank you. Any questions? Yes.
In the case of the screen reader support, was that just straight up maybe reading from the UI, reading from what would be the tooltip, reading out custom information for the UI?
Yeah, so for anything that's text, that's easy because you just have text there. Icons, we had to go in and label every icon with what the icon represents. Is this like a menu icon? Is this a cotton icon if it's like cotton farms or things like that? So we had to go through that. And then oftentimes there was like another invisible UI icon in front of it, and then we had to figure out how to navigate around invisible UI icons, and that was what took up a lot of time, is just adjusting for things like that. Yes?
What's a good way to find your blind spots? Like, for example, I've noticed that colorblind solutions are not always perfect. Like in Blizzard games, for example, I'm red-green colorblind, and they love to use colors of like shades of red. So when I play like Overwatch, all of the enemies are surrounded in a bubble of red, and it's supposed to help you see, but I can't see that color of red, so I run in and I don't see anything, but everyone else sees me. Or like in Diablo, there's they'll have a blood red health bar on a black backdrop against a dark green patch of grass, and I won't even see that. And you know Blizzard puts a lot of effort into their accessibility. So like, how do you find your blind spots? What are good ways to search for those?
So I want to say just, get a lot of people who are red-green colorblind, or colorblind in general, to play your game. In that particular case, like, they are aware of colorblindness, and so they can find people, for example. I guess it is harder if there are like kinds of accessibilities that you don't think about. And in that kind of blind spot, I'm not necessarily sure. Like I said, I gave some guideline like lists that could give you like a kind of starting point for that. And I think another tip that I've heard a lot is just make it as customizable for the player. In the case of like color blindness, like some people might have like certain colors that they prefer, and some people might have different ones, whereas the first person would be completely like invisible to them. So if the player can choose for themselves, that can be a good way to like give them the option to deal with what they need to deal with.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have any opinions on like what stage of the development process you can start talking about accessibility? Like, is this something that can come kind of later in development, or how early would you kind of recommend to start that conversation?
Yeah. So, like obviously in a prototyping stage, like you're not really looking for like when you're trying to just get ideas out, you're not trying to think of every possible like accessibility feature. But I think once you like kind of nail down your basic idea, it is probably a good idea to start thinking about it, even if it's not like something you act on immediately. I think the UI especially, or maybe I'm biased because that's what I had to work with and struggle with. As I said, it depends on how you define what a tool is. If you consider the ZData format as a tool because it is a thing that lets you do a thing easier, then there were examples right there in that example. Yeah, like it depends on where you define where one tool ends and where another one doesn't. Yes?
Without breaking any ideas, did the ZData format change at all during development? And if so, how did you adjust your tools?
I think the ZData format was pretty stable by the time we did these things. We did have like versions of the game code, or the game data that was different between different iterations of the game. And we had like ways of dealing with different versions of the game data. And I guess again, tools, that was someone else's tools, that wasn't like what I worked on, but there were tools for like migrating or just reading in old data and recognizing it was old data.
I have another versioning question then. If you were working on a game that was heavily dependent on content being made in custom tools, and the content developers wanted to get their hands on those tools as soon as possible. Do you have any tips on building the airplane while you're midair?
That's always a tricky question, right? Not sure if I have particular things. Good luck, right?
Not to put you on the spot. I can change to a different question. Which is, do you ever think about carrying a tool or any type of tool from project to project rather than making it bespoke for a specific game?
Yeah, so we had our own game engine, which was part of what ZData was kind of part of. Our general ZData editor works for any ZData for any game. Obviously, the farm-specific one I was giving an example of was specific to ARA, so there are some tools that wouldn't obviously carry over. Yes?
So when it comes to like the accessibility side, you said obviously involving folks with these actual like needs in the process is like a big part of it. I saw you make comments about like the Reddit that's out there, some of the YouTubers that have these designs for it. But when you make these like calls out for folks to playtest the game, is there like a specific avenue for folks to submit these kind of concerns that you list in like playtests and stuff, or do you go out of your way to get folks with that who can provide that knowledge for the project?
So, yeah, I wasn't really in charge of like getting playtesters and figuring that out. Those were other people in the company. I would guess the latter, but I'm really not sure like how they managed any of that. Yeah. Yes.
To build off that question, I was curious if you have any opinions on kind of talking about communication. What is effective talking to a tools engineer to try to be as accurate as possible on what you want to have happen?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, tell me what you want to have happen, but that's not very useful. But to, yeah, I guess, like, if you could prioritize what you really need, that's been a useful thing that we've done, where we just have, like, a list of priorities, and we would go and work from that list of priorities top to bottom instead of, I don't know, in a random order, and then you get some, like, random thing that you needed, but, like, not really essentially right now. Yeah, that's
Does it help if you watch people do the task? Like,
yeah. That's actually a very good point. I say talk to people. Yeah, it helps to actually like sit down with them, watch them use it for a little while. Obviously, this requires you to like create like a baseline tool so that they can use the tool as you watch and see where their sticking points are in their process. Yes.
When you're building out a tool for people, at a certain point you're going to want to move on. Can you speak to any standing resources that you create so that somebody who wants to use the tool doesn't have to come and ask you how to use it? Documentation, video tutorials, or whatever. Like, what do you put together?
So we did do some documentation, although largely we did just have them ask us directly, and we would be bouncing back and forth a little bit between whatever we're working on now and previously established tools. But yeah, like documentation is a really good one, just like lots of screenshots. I don't think we did video, that it would be a good idea. Yeah. Yes?
On the example of the text, did you guys ever have a conversation on like just using the high contrast text instead of the one that was kind of hard to read, or?
So in that example, it didn't look too bad, but in a lot of other cases, the black background would like overlap with, I mean, it's decorative iconography, so it's not like functionally problematic, but there were times when it would look bad, basically, is what I'm saying.
The high contrast?
Yeah, because it's a big black background over, again, it's decorative art, but it's still, art, so.
Do you have any thoughts on how you balance the artistic vision and like the accessibility side of these design decisions?
If you think about it earlier, that can help as, again, bring back to those points. If you design like higher contrast into the design at base, it's not necessarily as hard to Maybe add a little more contrast later on. And also, again, just having it as an option as opposed to something you set up once for everyone can let the player choose how much of the accessibility feature that they need, as opposed to just having maybe one accessibility or one setting. We have both a light mode and a dark mode for the high contrast, where it's white on black or black on white. Anything else? Yes.
What's the most satisfying kind of tool that you like to make?
The ones that get used and not ignored, because sometimes they make it cool and then we give it to them and they're like cool, and then they just don't use it.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Yes.
This is maybe like more business related than anything, but this is like a lot of work to serve a relatively small population of like all like the general players that might play your game. So how, as a kind of new studio that was making your first game, did you guys decide to like, focus your efforts so that it wasn't like a whole lot of work for kind of a smaller payoff?
Yeah, so again, like it is a larger proportion of the population than you would think, with like, I don't know, a quarter of adults in the US at least. But that said, I think it helps. This wasn't our first game, this was technically the second, but I think it helps that we are a large studio. We have enough resources to spend to, I basically was assigned accessibility tasks for several months straight, and we have the personnel to do that. So I don't know if like there was a much smaller studio, how we would have handled that. And again, we also worked with Microsoft with the Xbox accessibility guidelines and things like that. So we have some resources to help us with that.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
All right.